Rachel Cole installed a hidden camera in her own home to catch a man she was almost certain wasn't cheating on her. She was right. He wasn't. What that camera actually caught over the next 11 days was something Rachel would later say felt worse than an affair, and by the time she understood what it meant, she wasn't sure her marriage, or the man she married, had ever really existed the way she thought. This is the story of Daniel Cole, the man everyone in his small Ohio town called the perfect husband, and the smoke detector on his office ceiling that quietly took that title apart, clue by clue, over 11 days neither of them saw coming. By the end of this story, you'll understand why a man who never once raised his voice in 14 years of marriage kept a locked storage unit 40 minutes from his own house. You'll understand why a name neither Rachel nor anyone in her life had ever heard before became the center of everything. And you'll be left asking yourself the same question Rachel couldn't shake for months afterward. If the person lying next to you every night was capable of hiding this, quietly, for 6 straight years, what else could they be capable of hiding that you'd never think to look for? Daniel Cole never raised his voice, never missed a birthday, never gave Rachel a single reason to doubt him in 14 years of marriage. Rachel met him at a backyard cookout in the summer of 2009, introduced by a mutual friend, at a point in her life when she'd just come out of a relationship that left her cautious and slow to trust anyone new. Daniel felt like the opposite of everything that had hurt her. He listened. He remembered small details other people forgot. Within 18 months they were engaged, and they married the following October in her parents' backyard. Under string lights, her father had hung himself the week before. 2 children followed, a son and then a daughter, and Daniel folded into fatherhood the way he folded into everything else in his life, without complaint, without visible effort. He coached his son's little league team on weekends, showing up early to chalk the lines himself when the town's equipment fell short. He drove 40 minutes each way to his daughter's dance recitals and never once mentioned the traffic. Neighbors described him, half-jokingly, as suspiciously nice, the kind of husband other wives brought up at dinner parties as a gentle insult to their own. Rachel's own sister once said that Daniel was the reason the rest of the husbands in the family looked bad by comparison. Daniel worked as a regional sales manager for a logistics company 2 towns over, a steady, unremarkable job with a steady, unremarkable paycheck, the kind of career that never invites suspicion because it never invites attention either. His coworkers, when later asked, described him as reliable to the point of being forgettable, always at his desk by 8, always polite in meetings, never once the subject of office gossip in either direction. And for years, there was one detail about his schedule that nobody in his life thought twice about. Every day, without fail, Daniel left the house at exactly noon and returned at exactly 2 in the afternoon. He called it decompression time, a walk, sometimes a nap in his car in a parking lot near his office. It sounded almost too ordinary to question, and that, as Rachel would eventually learn, was precisely the point. Ordinary things are rarely investigated. That's what makes them the safest place in the world to hide something. There's a story Rachel's mother still tells about the year Daniel built an entire backyard playset from scratch after their son mentioned, once, in passing, that he wished they had one like a friend's. Daniel spent 3 weekends on it without ever mentioning what he was doing, and revealed it to their son as a surprise on an otherwise ordinary Saturday morning. It became, for years, the family's go-to example of exactly the kind of husband and father Daniel was, the kind who listened so closely to an offhand comment that he'd quietly spend a month turning it into something real. Rachel has said that story is one of the hardest things to sit with now, because it was never a lie. Daniel really was that attentive, that devoted, in almost every part of his life that Rachel could see. Rachel worked as a dental hygienist, raised their 2 children alongside him, and had built an entire life around the quiet certainty that Daniel was exactly who he appeared to be, the kind of certainty most people spend years hopping to feel and rarely question once they finally do. She trusted him with the small things and the large ones alike, the grocery budget, the kids' college fund, every late-night worry she'd ever had about their future. Daniel had a way of making every worry feel smaller just by being calm about it. And for 14 years, that calm was the foundation everything else in Rachel's life quietly rested on. But even the most reliable people have a crack somewhere, and Daniel's first one showed up 2 weeks before any of this began, at their daughter's dance recital, of all places. Daniel snapped at their son over nothing, something Rachel had never once seen him do in 14 years, apologizing within minutes but leaving her with a small, cold feeling she couldn't quite place at the time. Their son went quiet for the rest of the evening, picking at his food at dinner afterward, and Rachel remembers thinking even then that it wasn't like Daniel to leave a moment like that unrepaired for so long. It was nothing, she told herself. Every father has a bad day. She didn't write it down yet. She would soon. The first real crack appeared on an unremarkable Thursday, when Rachel found a receipt folded into the pocket of Daniel's jacket while doing laundry. It was from a furniture store 40 minutes outside their town, dated the exact weekend Daniel had told her he was away at a work conference in Cleveland. On its own, it meant almost nothing. People misplace receipts. People run errands they forget to mention. Rachel told herself this so many times that week that she almost believed it. She even rehearsed, out loud in the shower one morning, exactly how casually she'd ask him about it, before deciding not to ask at all, afraid of how foolish the question might sound out loud. She didn't throw the receipt away. She wrote the date down in a small spiral notebook she started keeping in her car, the first entry in what would become a much longer list, and told herself she was probably overreacting. That same night, she went back and added the recital, and the strange, cold feeling she still hadn't been able to name. Over the following 2 months, small inconsistencies began to gather the way they always do before anyone is willing to call them a pattern. A phone call that ended abruptly the moment Rachel walked into the room, Daniel's voice dropping mid-sentence into something closer to a whisper. A second phone bill, addressed to Daniel, from a carrier she'd never heard him mention, tucked behind the electric bill in a stack of mail he usually opened himself before she ever saw it. At their son's baseball practice, another father mentioned in passing that Daniel had missed the last 2 Saturday practices, something Rachel hadn't even realized, certain until that moment that Daniel's schedule outside those 2 hidden hours was as reliable as it had always been. She said nothing to the other father, only added the 2 missed Saturdays to her notebook, and drove home wondering how many other small absences she simply hadn't been paying close enough attention to notice. She confided in her sister one evening over coffee that had long since gone cold, describing each detail out loud for the first time, watching her sister's expression shift slowly from polite disbelief to genuine concern somewhere around the second missing phone bill. Her sister asked her the question Rachel had been avoiding for weeks. Maybe it was time she actually found out for herself, rather than continuing to build a case in her head out of receipts and silence. Rachel drove home that night replaying the conversation, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine an answer she had refused to imagine before, one that involved another woman entirely, one that made the ordinary details of her marriage suddenly feel unbearably heavy in a way she could not yet prove. She sat in her parked driveway for almost 20 minutes before going inside, staring at the dark windows of the home office where Daniel spent those 2 hours every single day, a room she realized, with a small shock, she had never once actually seen the inside of during that window of time in 14 years. She thought back, sitting there, to every small excuse she'd ever accepted without a second thought: the closed door, the noise machine he'd started running a few years back that he said helped him focus, the way he always seemed to know exactly when she was about to knock before she ever did. None of it had ever struck her as strange while it was happening. It was only now, replaying all of it at once in the dark of her own driveway, that the pattern started to look less like privacy and more like practice. That was the moment Rachel decided the notebook alone wasn't going to be enough anymore. She ordered a camera disguised as a smoke detector, legal in her state since it recorded video only, and installed it above Daniel's desk while he was at work, promising herself she'd take it down the moment it showed her nothing. Her hands were shaking the entire time, certain he would somehow walk in and catch her standing on a chair with a screwdriver, certain, too, that she was about to feel foolish for doubting a man who had given her, on paper, no real reason to. 2 days later, it showed her Daniel on the phone during his decompression hour, speaking to someone he called only Ren, in a voice careful enough that it didn't sound like any conversation she'd ever heard him have. He glanced at the door twice during the call, something she'd never once seen him do while on a work call in 14 years. She wrote the name in her notebook, beneath the receipt and the recital, and circled it. It wouldn't be the last time. 4 days later, the second clip arrived, and it told her something the first one hadn't. Daniel walked into the office carrying a laptop Rachel had never seen before, one with no company stickers, no familiar wear on the case, and spent nearly an hour moving files onto a small drive before sliding it into his sock and checking the doorway before he left. In the corner of the screen, for less than a second, Rachel caught a torn scrap of paper with part of a routing number printed on it before Daniel folded it out of frame. She paused on that single frame more than a dozen times, trying and failing to make out the rest of the number before finally giving up. She checked their joint bank statements that same night, line by line, and found nothing out of place, which told her whatever this was, it lived entirely outside the life she could see. She added the detail to her notebook next to Ren's name and underlined it twice. Whatever this was, it wasn't nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. That weekend, their son asked her, out of nowhere, why Dad always seemed to be somewhere else lately, even when he was sitting right next to them at the dinner table. Rachel told him his father was just tired from work. She wrote her son's question down in the notebook that same night, word for word, unable to shake the feeling that an 8-year-old had noticed something she'd spent 14 years failing to. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The third clip, 6 days after the first, showed a woman Rachel didn't recognize standing briefly in the office doorway, talking to Daniel for less than a minute before disappearing from frame. Rachel noticed the woman's coat, expensive, unfamiliar, and the easy way she leaned against the doorframe like she'd done it before. She noticed, too, the way Daniel's posture shifted the moment the woman appeared, straightening slightly, the way people sometimes do around someone they're trying not to seem too comfortable with. Rachel was certain, watching it, that she finally had her answer. An affair. Simple, painful, and at least explainable. She almost stopped watching altogether that night, telling her sister she wasn't sure she wanted proof of anything more specific. The next clip changed everything. 2 days after that, the same woman appeared again, long enough this time for Rachel to catch a fragment of what she was saying, something about a shipment, a delivery date, a client Daniel needed to call back. Not romance. Logistics. Rachel noticed this time that the woman carried a slim folder of her own, tapping it twice against her palm the way someone does when they're finishing a routine visit rather than starting an intimate one. Rachel felt relief and a colder unease in the same breath, because if this wasn't an affair, she had no idea what it actually was, and the not knowing frightened her more than the fear had. She wrote in her notebook that night, not an affair, worse. Rachel had no idea what she was about to discover. The fifth clip came 3 days later and gave her the name that would consume the rest of this story. Daniel opened a manila folder at his desk, spread its contents in full view of the camera, financial documents, old photographs, and a single page with a name typed at the top that Rachel had never once heard in 14 years of marriage. He stared at that page for a long time, his hand lingering on one of the photographs before he locked the folder back inside a file cabinet she'd always assumed held nothing but tax paperwork. Before locking it away, he pulled his phone out and typed something quickly, deleting it twice before finally sending a message Rachel would never see the contents of. Rachel wrote the name down. Marcus Wren. She had no idea yet who he was. Neither will you, not for a while longer. What Rachel found searching that name online didn't explain anything. Public filings tied a Marcus Wren to a business collapse more than a decade earlier, under a name that wasn't Daniel's, in a state 300 miles away. No photo, no current address, no answer to the only question that mattered, which was what this stranger had to do with her husband, her marriage, or the 2 hours a day she'd never once been allowed inside. She found a single archived news photograph from the collapse, grainy and badly cropped, showing 3 men standing outside a courthouse, none of their faces clear enough to recognize, and spent almost an hour with a magnifying glass held up to her phone screen trying to decide if one of them could possibly be Daniel under a different name. She couldn't tell. She added the photograph to her notebook anyway, taped in beside his name, and left the rest of the page blank, waiting to be filled in. She remembered then a storage unit key she'd found years earlier in Daniel's gym bag, one he'd explained away as his late father's old tools. She had never asked to see inside it. Now she copied the key at a hardware store 2 counties away, telling no one, and sat with that copy in her palm for a full day before deciding to use it. It was, she has said since, the moment she understood there was no version of this that ended with her simply putting the camera away and going back to normal. She wrote the date in her notebook and for the first time wrote beneath it, "No turning back now." Inside the unit, there were no tools. There was a locked box under the old name, a stack of receipts made out to names she didn't recognize, dozens of them spanning 6 years, and folded inside an envelope at the bottom, a photograph of Daniel with a teenage girl Rachel had never seen in her life, an inscription on the back reading, "To the only father I've ever really had." Beside the envelope sat a small stack of birthday cards, unsent, each one addressed to the same girl and signed only with an initial, as though Daniel had written them every year and never once found the courage to mail them. Among the receipts, Rachel noticed one dated almost exactly to the week their daughter was born, a transfer sent to a family whose name meant nothing to her yet, and she sat with that particular detail longer than any of the others, unable to decide whether it made her feel closer to Daniel or further away from him. Rachel sat on the concrete floor holding the photograph longer than anything else in the unit, and for the first time in 11 days, she considered a possibility darker than money. A child, a whole other family. She photographed every page, wrote the girl's initials into her notebook with a question mark beside them, and drove home without knowing what she believed anymore. But that wasn't the worst part. The very next afternoon, the camera caught something Rachel hadn't expected it to catch at all. Daniel came home early, went straight to the office, and made a phone call in a voice tight with something close to fear, telling whoever answered that the lock on the unit felt different, that he thought someone might have been inside. Rachel sat frozen watching it, realizing the camera had just recorded her own husband reacting to her, without either of them saying a word to the other. She wrote in her notebook that night, "He knows something is wrong, he just doesn't know it's me." Their daughter came into the kitchen that same evening, while Rachel was writing, tugging at her sleeve to ask what was in the notebook she kept carrying around the house. Rachel closed it quickly and told her it was just a to-do list, and her daughter shrugged and asked if Dad was on it, then wandered off before Rachel could answer. Rachel sat with that question long after the kitchen had gone quiet, unable to decide if it had been an innocent thing for a 7-year-old to say, or the second time in a week one of her own children had noticed something she still couldn't fully explain to herself. The following day gave her a detail that undid everything she thought she'd finally settled into believing. Digging through the old business filings a second time, cross-referencing a name from one of the storage unit receipts, Rachel found a court record she'd missed the first time through. A restraining order filed against the business years earlier, not against Daniel's old name, but against Marcus Wren himself, filed by a former client who accused him of harassment during the collapse's aftermath. She read the filing 3 times, trying to reconcile it with everything else she thought she'd already figured out, and found herself, for the first time since starting this search, more frightened of the man she'd never met than the husband sitting across the dinner table from her every night. For a full day, Rachel considered a possibility that terrified her more than an affair or a hidden child ever had, that Wren wasn't helping Daniel make anything right at all, that he might be the one holding something over her husband instead, and that the 6 years of secrecy might have far less to do with guilt than with fear. She wrote his name in her notebook a second time, circled twice, with the word blackmail written beside it in letters she later admitted she wished she'd never had to write down. She almost called her attorney that same afternoon, phone already in her hand, before deciding she needed one more piece of proof before she made a call she couldn't take back. The camera gave her one more discovery before she ever worked up the nerve to confront him, and it was the one that stayed with her longest. 2 nights after the storage unit, Daniel sat alone at his desk long after the children were asleep, the same photograph in his hands, and said a name out loud to an empty room. Emily. He told her, in a voice breaking apart in a way Rachel had never heard from him, that he was sorry, that he should have told her mother the truth years ago, that he'd promised her father he would make it right, and that Rachel still didn't know any of it. His hands were shaking. He pressed the photograph flat against his chest for a moment, the way a person holds something they're afraid of dropping, before finally putting it away and sitting in the dark for a long time. Rachel watched that clip 4 times and didn't sleep at all that night, certain now that whatever this secret was, it was bigger and older, and far more painful than anything she had let herself imagine so far. She spent the following morning debating whether to confront him that same day or wait until the weekend, when her sister could be there, and ultimately chose to wait, telling herself 2 more days wouldn't change anything now that she had already come this far. Those 2 days were the longest of the entire 11, she has said since, filled with ordinary dinners and ordinary bedtime stories that felt, for the first time, like she was watching her own family from somewhere just outside it, waiting for a conversation neither of them yet knew was coming. She confronted him that Sunday, sliding the folder and the photograph across the kitchen table while her sister sat beside her. Daniel looked at the photograph first, then at Rachel, and in the silence that followed she later said she already knew this wasn't going to be a simple denial. He didn't argue. He didn't reach for an excuse. He looked instead like a man finally allowed to put something down that he'd been carrying alone for 6 years, his shoulders dropping in a way Rachel had never once seen in 14 years of marriage. And what he told her wasn't the story she'd spent 11 days preparing herself to hear. He started, she said, not with an explanation but with an apology, one that lasted almost a full minute before he said anything specific at all, repeating that he was sorry, that he'd wanted to tell her 100 times, before Rachel finally asked him to simply start from the beginning and stop apologizing until she understood what exactly he was apologizing for. He started with the girl in the photograph, because he said he owed Rachel that much before anything else. Her name was Emily. Her father, a man named Robert, had been one of Daniel's clients back when Daniel still went by a different name, in a different state, running a business that collapsed under allegations of serious financial mismanagement more than a decade earlier. Robert had trusted Daniel with almost everything his family owned, and when the business fell apart, Robert lost his savings, his house, and eventually, 2 years later, his life, to a heart attack his widow always believed had been brought on by the stress of losing everything. Emily had been 11 years old at the time. She grew up believing the man responsible for it had simply vanished. Daniel said he still remembered the exact afternoon he learned Robert had died, reading it in a local newspaper clipping a former colleague forwarded him months after the fact, and that it was the moment the guilt stopped being an abstract thing he could outrun by changing his name and became something he carried every single day afterward, whether Rachel ever saw it on his face or not. He said he used to imagine, in the earliest years of their marriage, that if he simply became a good enough husband and a good enough father, it might somehow balance out what he'd taken from a family he'd never even properly apologized to. He said there were nights, early in their marriage, when he'd lie awake beside her rehearsing exactly how he'd tell her the truth, only to watch her sleeping peacefully beside him and lose his nerve before morning came, telling himself there would be a better time, a calmer week, a year when the children were a little older and could handle whatever came after. He hadn't vanished. He had changed his name, moved 3 states away, and eventually met Rachel at a backyard cookout, building an entirely new life on top of a debt he told himself he would find some way to repay quietly someday, without ever having to explain the mess it came from. Marcus Wren, he explained, was the one person from that old life who refused to let him disappear from what he owed. Wren had tracked him down years later at a trade conference neither of them expected the other to attend, recognizing him instantly despite the new name, and had spent an entire evening in a hotel lobby convincing Daniel that hiding from the debt forever was worse than facing what remained of it, quietly, without ever making Rachel or the children pay any part of the cost. For 6 years, working through Wren, Daniel had been anonymously repaying every family his old business had ruined, funneling the money through a small consulting operation, so none of it could ever be traced back to Rachel. Emily's family had been the hardest to help, since Emily's mother, still grieving and suspicious of any unexplained kindness, had nearly gone to the police more than once, believing the anonymous payments were part of some new scheme rather than an old debt finally being settled. Daniel had eventually stepped in more directly once Emily reached college age, quietly covering her tuition through a scholarship fund Wren helped set up in a name that traced back to neither of them. And Emily, never knowing who her benefactor really was, had started calling him, in letters she believed went to a kind stranger, the only father figure she had left. Rachel asked him, finally, about the restraining order she'd found filed against Wren years earlier, the detail that had convinced her, for one full day, that Wren might be blackmailing her husband rather than helping him. Daniel almost laughed, for the first time all night, explaining that the order had come from an unrelated client dispute Wren settled long before he ever reconnected with Daniel, and had nothing to do with any of this at all, though he admitted, quietly, that he understood exactly why it had looked the way it did to someone trying to make sense of a stranger's name from the outside. Rachel asked him, staring at the photograph, why he had let himself become that to a child while never once telling his own family any of it. Daniel admitted there wasn't a good answer, only that somewhere in the last 6 years, becoming that person to Emily had started to feel like the only proof he had that the man Rachel married wasn't a lie all the way through, even if the 6 hidden years underneath it were. She asked him about the woman in the doorway, and Daniel explained she was Wren's accountant, brought in twice that month to help finalize the last of the repayments before the whole arrangement could finally be closed for good. The same woman Rachel had once been so certain was the center of an affair that never existed at all. She asked him about the raised voice the camera had caught, and he admitted it was the day Emily's mother had come closest yet to involving the police, forcing Wren to spend an entire weekend convincing her otherwise. And she asked him, finally, about the 2 hours a day, the one she had built 11 days of suspicion around, and Daniel told her simply that they were the only hours in his life he had ever spent being completely honest with anyone, and that the terrible irony of that had not been lost on him for a single one of the 6 years it had gone on. Rachel asked him the only question she had left. Why hide something you were doing for the right reason? Daniel didn't have an answer that satisfied either of them that night, only that the silence had gone on so long it had started to feel safer than the truth, until a smoke detector on his own ceiling proved it never was. Rachel realized, sitting across from him, that the hidden camera hadn't exposed an affair. It had exposed the perfect husband, the version of Daniel everyone believed in completely, the version that had never once been the whole story. She sat with Daniel at that kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning, long after her sister had quietly excused herself, both of them talking in fragments, circling the same handful of questions neither of them had full answers to. At one point, their son wandered downstairs for water, saw them still sitting there, and asked, half asleep, if everything was okay. Rachel told him yes, go back to bed, and watched him climb the stairs without noticing that neither of his parents had actually answered the question. She filed for divorce not long after, unable to build a future on a foundation she'd never been allowed to see. But she has said since that she no longer thinks of Daniel as the villain of this particular story, only as a man who chose secrecy over the one conversation that might have saved him. Daniel completed the final repayments within months, closing the account for good and disclosing his original identity voluntarily rather than let it linger any longer than it already had. She closed the notebook for the last time the night the divorce was finalized, placing it in a drawer rather than the trunk of her car, where it had lived for 11 days that ended up reshaping the rest of her life. Could you forgive someone who lied for years if the secret was meant to make things right? Tell us in the comments, and tell us exactly which clip you think you would have stopped watching at, because Rachel has said more than once that the honest answer for most people probably isn't as far as they'd like to believe. Tell us, too, whether you think Daniel deserved 6 years of silence to try to fix what he broke, or whether some debts can only ever be repaid honestly, out in the open, regardless of how much harder that conversation might have been. And if this story kept you until the very last word, wait until you hear what happens next, because our next case involves a husband who vanished for 11 days and the one detail his wife almost missed. Subscribe now so you never miss it.